defending the free market, and making the moral case for capitalism. The Justin Moore Show.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Justin Moore Show, where we make sense of what's going on in this crazy, insane, out of control world. And now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm actually recording this. I just got back from training. Well, that was like 2 days ago. And actually, when I was in the airport in Denver, before I got home on Friday evening, I'm looking at some stories and I'm seeing there was some guy who had like a 4-hour standoff with police in Billings. And then some other guy, he robbed a bank in downtown Billings. I'm wondering, like, what the hell is going on over there? It's like, dang, I'm gone for a week and stuff just goes to hell? Well, apparently Billings needs me back or something. So it's just, as I start off the show, crazy, insane, out of control world. Little old Billings. You know, you got people robbing banks and having standoffs with police. But I think I don't know if they found the guy who has robbed the bank yet. But the other guy did show up for court for the 4-hour standoff. Now, you know, as I got home and I'm trying to catch up, it's like, what the heck should I do an episode on? And I'm scrolling through Facebook. I saw a few people, they're irritated with what's going on with the airlines. One guy, you know, upset, you know, he can't get on his flight, that sort of thing. And hey, look, that stuff is understandable. Now that I work for the airlines part-time, look, I'm not going to say like, oh no, you know, because usually people want to defend the things that they do, right? You know, you don't want to see, like, if you're engaged in some sort of government job, you want to say, hey, well, look, my job is necessary. You can't get rid of me. Yeah, we need to shrink the size of government, but no, what I do is necessary. Man, nobody in the private sector could do what I'm doing, you know. So there's always that bias there. But look, I can tell you guys, actually, I meant to say this a few weeks ago when I had mentioned that I got a job with United Airlines. And it's this. Basically, and this is going to sound kind of crazy, when I had to go through so many different forms, when I confirmed, like, yes, I want to, when they asked me, hey, Justin, would you like the job? And I said yes. After that, there was a bunch of these applications I had to fill out. And yeah, I handle a lot of mail from the airplane. And so that's why I had to fill out a form. It's like I was working for the government, the USPS form. I had to fill that out. Had to go through several background checks. And actually one of the final things I had to do before I started my first day on the job is I had to go get my fingerprints done. Well, in Billings, apparently, because it's such a small little operation there, they don't have a fingerprint scanner. So I had to fly to Denver to get my fingerprints done and then fly right back. Yeah, so that was the only reason I went to Denver, was to get my fingerprints done. And I would take the next flight back. Well, I show up on a Monday, and I don't know, my flight was going to leave like at 7:15 a.m. And there was high winds, you know, around Denver and Billings. Well, apparently at the Denver airport, they limited the runway down to, there's only 2 runways open. And so all the flights were delayed. So here I'm sitting. I was waiting in the airport lobby in Billings for over 5 hours. I couldn't get on a plane because I kept getting delayed. And I called basically the new employee recruit. And I'm like, hey, let's just reschedule, because I didn't see that there was going to be a flight back that I would make. It's like, I'm not going to spend the night in Denver just to get my fingerprints done, you know. So we rescheduled for Wednesday. So I come back 2 days later, and luckily things went smoothly. You know, I wasn't delayed. But however, the flight was overbooked, and I was afraid that I wasn't going to get on the plane, because I can't remember what the term is that they use, where that because I wasn't a must ride, I think is the terminology. And so if the flight was overbooked, you know, and they asked over the intercom, like, okay, hey, look, if you will get a $500 voucher if you choose to take the later flight. And for the longest time, nobody was willing to take the voucher. And I'm just thinking, oh my gosh, I was here for 5 hours just 2 days ago, and I paid, you know, $15 for parking, didn't get anything accomplished. Now here I'm back, and I might have to wait for the next flight, which will be several hours. It's like, this just keeps getting worse. And all I want to get done is my fingerprints. But luckily, some guy, or was it a girl, I can't remember which, took the voucher. But then I find out when I got back from Denver from getting my fingerprints done that the lady who I now work with, and we kind of laugh about it now, and she's like, oh, by the way, nice to meet you and welcome to working with United. But yeah, I found out later that, yes, I was a must ride. So I guess that wouldn't have been a problem. But I was scared crapless, especially when I was in Denver, when I got done with my fingerprints, and that flight was overbooked. And I'm just thinking, oh my gosh, you've got to be kidding me. So it was kind of a stressful time. Just the fingerprint thing probably took 10 minutes. Oh, wait. Oh, guys. Wait, did I tell you guys this? Oh, I can't remember. I might have. I'm trying to think through that episode. I don't know. Okay, well, just forgive me. It's just going to take me 30 seconds to say this. So when I was getting my fingerprints done, they had me fill out a form. Yeah, I'm pretty sure I told you guys this. Oh, anyway. And she had, red pens, like probably 3 out of the 5 pens in the little jar thing, the little cup to grab out of so you can fill the form. 3 of them were red pens. Well, I filled out the form in red, and I'm thinking like, yeah, usually red's not a good color to use this in. Well, I turn in the form to her, and she's like, yeah, you can't fill this out in red. You got to redo the form. So here I am in the office when it's like, yeah. And I asked her, I'm like, well, why do you have red pens for me to use if I can't use a red pen? It doesn't even make any sense. This world is insane. And yeah, so I had to fill out the form again. Luckily, I was a boss at the form the second time, and I knew I could fill that thing out, no problem. So, first world problems, right? So yeah, so that's just my little United story there, and it does suck. There are delays with airlines. Things happen. Things are beyond your control sometimes. You just, especially weather. The airlines can't control the weather. Now, there are some mechanical things, sure. And actually, since I work what's called below the wing, there's some things that I could do. I could screw up, and I could delay a flight. Like when the airplane lands in, and you have to connect in ground power, and say you go to disconnect right when the plane's ready to leave, and say if you disconnect the ground power to the airplane before you get okay from the pilot, it's like resetting a computer when you're in the middle of typing a document, and when it screws up everything, you have to reboot up everything. They have to put back in their flight plans. That will cause a delay. And so there's just little things like that. Like, until you work for the airlines, any little thing. But the things like that, yeah, you should. When you're trained in, you shouldn't make those mistakes. Or, when there's people coming on the flight late, you have to hurry and open up the luggage compartment again after you had the belt loader pulled up to the airplane. And little things like that can cause a delay. So it can be the people too, which people don't look at it from that way. Because obviously, if you don't work for the airlines, you don't see that part. You just realize, oh, a delay. Okay, great. But actually, most of our flights out of Billings, since I've started working there, there's probably been one where we were a few minutes late. Everything else, we've been early, taking off from the ground. So anyway, guys, what I want to do on today's show, just to jump into the meat of it, is that I'm looking at a bunch of different pieces and so forth. Well, I come across a book review by John Tamny, and I've had John Tamny on the show 2 times. He's a good guy. But he did a book review of Danielle DiMartino Booth's book, and I think it's called Fed Up. And I've just started the book. I've gotten through the introduction of the book, and that's pretty much it. Just the start of chapter 1. So basically, it's like I haven't even started the book yet. So I'm going to have to take John Tamny's word for it in a few parts here and things that she points out. But I found this to be very interesting. And now John Tamny and I, back during Freedom Fest of last year, so 2016, probably a few days before Freedom Fest, I sent out a message to John Tamny. I'm like, hey, look, I just finished reading your latest book. I think the name of his book, now I guess Ron Paul named his book, End the Fed. It's something to do with our Fed. I can't remember what he called it, but basically John Tamny's going after the Federal Reserve and basically points out that it's irrelevant. And actually in this piece I'm going to read here, John Tamny's making the same points. When I sent this message to John Tamny, I'm like, okay, I really appreciate what you do with the book. I love how you challenged me. However, I'm like, help me out here. Like, I don't follow you with these certain points. So I was being as diplomatic as I could. I mean, there's some things that he said in the book. I'm just like, okay, no, look, I would agree with you if we had a 100% reserve requirement, if we didn't have a central bank. Look, I think you're spot on. Because there's one thing he says in his book over and over again. He says credit is real resources, which if we didn't have a fractional reserve banking system, he's right. Credit would be real resources. But that gets distorted with the fractional reserve banking system and the Fed creating new money. So there's things in the book, and you guys actually should read this book. Because it's a great way to challenge you. But it's like he's in no man's land where he's a little bit Austrian, but then I don't know. He's in his own little category where he disagrees with the Austrian school, and actually he points out in his book Tom Woods flat out. And when I was on the Contra Cruise, I asked Tom Woods about that. It's like, hey, look, he called you out in his book, and I wanted Tom Woods' opinion on it. And actually, that when Tom Woods had John Tamny on his podcast to talk about his latest book about the Fed, man, they really got into it there for a little bit. I should go back and listen to that exchange there at the end, because that was very entertaining. And man, you could tell Tom Woods was heated. But yeah, I don't know. John Tamny's really going after the Austrian school. Now, I'm not saying Austrians, okay, yeah, always 100% perfect, but I think, and actually, just to clear up, I'll try to lay out where I think John Tamny really is wrong on some of the stuff, but then he's also right, and he's criticizing this Danielle DiMartino Booth with some of the things that she says in her book. So I don't know. Like I said to start off this show, I might need to do a part 2 on this, because when I was going through reading John Tamny's book from my Kindle, I went and I highlighted a bunch of points, and he would bring up some examples trying to prove his point, but it's like, that doesn't even make any sense. So, John Tamny, he's a great guy, but him and I, man, we had an exchange on Facebook, private message, back and forth. Man, that thing got heated. Because I was going to have him on my show to talk about his latest book, but yeah, that's I don't think it would really work out. And if you're trying to sell copies of a book, I can't just do a snowball interview. I have to get down to, okay, look, this is how you disagree. It doesn't mean that I'm gonna be disrespectful. I'm always going to be respectful, even though someone I don't agree with, and I would make little points. I was always being diplomatic in that Facebook exchange I had with John Tamny. And now for him, I can understand he's in a difficult position where when you feel like everybody in the world disagrees with you, and I don't know, it's like there's something missing that I see where he's coming from, but it's like, but I don't think he truly understands where I'm coming from. I don't know. It's like he's missing a certain little portion of information that makes it so he can't see eye to eye, is kind of the way I see it. But anyway, I've kind of been talking a little bit longer to introduce this piece longer than I planned on. But let's just start off. Basically, I kind of pulled through several paragraphs from his piece. I mean, this piece on Forbes, if you guys want to check it out, let me just tweet this thing out on Twitter. It's 6 pages long from Forbes' website. So it's a really long piece, but I try to narrow it down, and I still probably have, 8 paragraphs? I don't know. I don't even know if I'll read all those. I'm not sure what I'll do here. But let's just start off with the way he introduces the piece, and it's coming directly from this Danielle DiMartino Booth's book. And from the piece. Damn Ron Paul, the congressman's 2009 book, End the Fed, called the bank corrupt and unconstitutional and urged his abolition. Though Paul made some good points, America is not a banana republic. It needs a strong and independent central bank. Okay, as I just said, this is coming from this Danielle DiMartino Booth's book called Fed Up. Just came out. And I will get through the whole book. I just haven't done it yet. So I'll have to update and do a newer podcast after I've read her book and I can offer my own critiques. But here she is. This woman saying, the title of her book is Fed Up. She's saying the Fed is incompetent, all this stuff. But she's saying, hey, look, we need a strong and independent central bank. Okay, well, that makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? Well, later on, when I read from John Tamny's piece here, basically where she's coming from is that, just the right people aren't in charge. Man, that sounds an awful lot like a lot of socialists out there. Oh, yes, socialism would work if we just had the right people in power. Yeah, it hasn't worked in these certain countries because of those guys are incompetent. What a bunch of crap. All right, anyway, let's just continue on with the piece here. Much more than the Fed's critics and supporters would like us to believe, the Fed quite simply isn't that relevant. It deals with massively overregulated and antiquated banks that represent a small and declining 15% percentage of total credit in the U.S. economy. Not to mention that banks are easily the least dynamic source of credit for what is the most dynamic economy in the world. As for the popular notion that the Fed creates credit, let's be serious. Pursuit of credit isn't the pursuit of dollars created at the Fed as much as it's the pursuit of real resources like trucks, tractors, computers, desks, chairs, buildings, labor, etc. The Fed can't create, increase, or shrink what borrowers of dollars are in need of as much as it can distort the direction of credit, albeit not that much. Okay. So, I mean, this is kind of what I was pointing out earlier here from John Tamny, how he's saying credit is real resources, which in a truly free market without fractional reserve banking, he's absolutely right. So I can agree with him, but the system we have today, that is not true. And so John Tamny's pointing out, okay, look, the Fed it's really irrelevant. Only 15% of banking today comes from these overregulated banks. I mean, yeah, it's true. There is a lot of other places people can get lending. But actually, it's interesting when people when people are borrowing to buy cars right now, from car dealerships, and I've done several episodes now talking about the coming collapse in the car industry. I mean, it's probably about 2 years ago now. I've pointed out the problems, and it's really starting to come undone here. How it's like there's a bigger percentage of people. I want to say it's like 80% of people who are buying a new car today, they finance through the dealership. So I guess that's not borrowing from a bank, but really, okay, if you're borrowing from the dealership, they're going through a bank, okay, or a credit union, right? So I guess I don't know how he's counting that 15%, but certainly the Fed is not irrelevant. I'm sorry, John Tamny, but I strongly disagree with you there. If the Fed was irrelevant, then why do people give a damn so much what the FOMC says? And oh my gosh, they're going to raise interest rates. I don't know. I strongly disagree with him right there. Okay, let's just move on here. The problem is that Booth believes the Fed would make sense where its staffers more in touch with reality, presumably like her. If they had ever worked in the private sector, as she has, if they ever watched CNBC, as she does with great regularity, and if copies of the Financial Times didn't sit unread inside the walls of the central bank. Again, she's right about the incompetence at the Fed, but her belief that the right people could make the Fed useful amounts to a fatal conceit. That doesn't stand up to scrutiny any more than Paul's view, that the Fed is behind much of what weakens the U.S. economically. Okay, so here's John Tamny. This is what I was talking about earlier, how it's no man's land. Okay, he's going after this Danielle DiMartino Booth. Okay, and rightfully so in certain circumstances, absolutely. But then he's also going after Ron Paul, because Ron Paul and much of us, we Austrians, were like, hey, look, the Fed causes a lot of our economic problems. Now, of course, that's tied in with massive government regulations and just the government intervening in the economy in general. But yeah, absolutely, the Fed is what really starts and gets these bubbles going. And actually, I'm going to read a little bit later in this piece here where John Tamny's pointing out that that's not true. And he says, basically, we Austrians are delusional. Okay, let's just move on here. Money and the resources exchangeable for money always migrate to where there's productivity and migrates away from where productivity is undetectable. No amount of Fed meddling can change that. Booth is peddling a commonly accepted but logically false history about the Fed during the Great Depression. Okay, John Tamny. When the interest rates and the federal funds rate is artificially low, certain people are going to expand their businesses where maybe it didn't make sense before. So I don't know what you're talking about. Okay, sure. Naturally, people want to invest where they can have the most productivity. But if you're a businessman in the sector that you engage in business and commerce, if it makes sense for you to build a factory and if you can pencil it out and you're like, I guess, man, if I can increase my productivity and it's all based on this artificially high demand, I'm going to expand my factory. I'm going to expand my business. I'm going to expand my restaurant. But when things go back to normal, quote unquote, you could have increased your business where now you have a lot of idle space. I mean, you have your fixed costs are through the roof now based on what you thought was going to be the future demand. I mean, you were speculating. At the end of the day, all entrepreneurs are speculators. Nobody knows the future. So we have to take the information that is in front of us, and a low federal funds rate is a little bit of information, right? That tells us, maybe this is a good time to invest with these low interest rates. Maybe it's a good time to buy a car when there's low interest rates. That's what people are looking at. So I'm not sure what John Tamny is getting to there. I mean, to a certain extent, he's right about productivity, but he's also a little bit wrong from my perspective. Okay, let's continue on here. Booth asserts that Alan Greenspan's Fed blew another bubble with a low Fed funds rate that led to a housing boom. In Booth's defense, Her analysis is broadly shared by most in the economics commentariat, despite it being easy to disprove. Indeed, a read of Sebastian Malaby's mostly weak and misanalyzed of Alan Greenspan reveals that interest rates from the Fed were a sideshow when it came to the 21st century housing boom. Booth felt she was bringing unique knowledge to the Greenspan Fed about what it was doing. But as Malaby makes clear, Greenspan had seen this housing boom movie before in the 1970s, and it has nothing to do with the Fed's target rate meant to influence the cost of overnight lending. The 70s reveal popular arguments about the Fed's role in the slow growth housing rush of the 2000s as wildly false. Not only does consumption of housing shrink economic growth, the latter the principal flaw in the Townsend-Greenspan thesis, which said housing consumption was a stimulant, it soars for reasons unrelated to the central bank's rate target. Getting into specifics, hard assets do well during periods of currency weakness. The U.S. Treasury devalued the dollar in both the 70s and 2000s. So while the Fed employed interest rate policies in the 2000s that were the exact opposite of how it operated in the 70s, the result was the same. The Fed was and is largely a sideshow when it comes to housing health, or lack thereof, despite what we're frequently told. Okay, that's kind of a lot there I just read. So I'm just going to summarize it in like a sentence or two. So what John Tamny's saying, he's like, look, the U.S. Treasury, the government, during the 1970s and 2000s, they devalued the dollar. But he's saying that the way that the Fed reacted in terms of interest rates was the exact opposite, but they had the same result. So he's pointing out that, look, that's irrelevant then. Because in the 70s, you saw interest rates going up, right? You had double-digit interest rates. What, you saw a high interest rate of 20.5%, right? I mean, that's insane. Could you imagine that today? Yeah, so that happened during the 70s. But in the 2000s, we had, a target interest rate, around 3%, it was really low. And but anyway, so John Tamny's pointing out, well, look, if you had exact opposite interest rate policies, but the result is the same, so all you Austrians out there, you guys are full of it. What you guys are saying makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. I'm pointing out, look at this example I just gave, is what John Tamny's saying. Now, here's what I have to say to John Tamny right here. Obviously, he's missing completely the inflation that happened in the 1960s. If we go back in history, and I like to use this example to people, quarters minted 1964 and older were made of 90% silver. So why did the government take the silver out of the coins in 1965? Why did they do it? Because inflation in the system made it so they weren't making any money on the coins. It was too costly to use that same metal. They had to go to a cheaper form. They couldn't use silver anymore. That is why. And there was a silver shortage. So we had massive inflation in the 1960s. Why did Nixon take us off the gold standard in 1971? Because a bunch of gold was leaving the system, because people like countries like over in France and later Switzerland and Britain, they wanted their gold instead of the dollar. Because we're saying, oh yeah, the dollar, we're as good as gold, No. Yeah, and so they were exchanging their dollars. One ounce of gold would exchange for $35. And so those other countries are like, you know what? I'd rather take my ounce of gold, and you guys in the United States, you can take your $35. And so a bunch of gold was leaving our country. And so Nixon had to take us off the gold standard so we could keep the gold in our country. That is what happened. So here's John Tamny. Oh, well, see, we started hiking up interest rates. Yeah, we're trying to hike up interest rates because of the massive inflation we had, the amount of overspending we had. Look at LBJ. He was the largest spending president, since FDR? So I don't know what he's talking about. He seems that he's not even thinking about the 1960s at all. And so basically what we had in the 1970s was the inflation from the 60s, the overspending of government from the 60s. And so we're just trying to rein in inflation. So yeah, we had to hike up interest rates to rein it in. And now in 2000, we had the collapse of the tech stock bubble. But yeah, we had low interest rates, and that was spurring the housing bubble. People started investing in houses. People, yes, were flipping houses. People were borrowing against their houses. So what he's pointing out here as basically a way to get all of us Austrians to shut up. makes absolutely no sense. He's completely missing out on what I just said in regards to the 60s. And what I just said was a perfect example of how in the hell, if there was no inflation in the 60s, if there wasn't a massive inflation problem in the 60s, then why did we take 90% of the silver out of our quarters? A quarter minted 1964 and older, or the dimes 1964 and older, you know what those are called today? It's called junk silver. And some of my physical investing in silver I have done, I own the physical coins. I own some half dollars, 1964 and older. I own some quarters. I own some dimes. And you guys remember, probably on 2 of my episodes I've done, and I like to give these away for wedding gifts, is I give out silver. And the argument I always make, I think the date I use is 1948. I say, hey, look, in 1948, you could buy a gallon of gas for 25 cents. Wouldn't it be nice to buy a gallon of gas for 25 cents? Well, if you pull up what the value of a quarter 1964 and older is, and you look at what a gallon of gas is, guess what? You can still buy a gallon of gas for 25 cents. That's the point I make. And that shows the massive inflation in the system. And so there you go. Okay, anyway, I really went off there. Okay, man, I just have 2 more paragraphs here, and we're going to be done with this piece here. Okay. Volcker took over at the Fed in 1979, only to begin a failed 3-year monetarist experiment whereby an always inept Fed would presume to plan economic growth by virtue of it vainly trying to plan money supply. Volcker's timing is instructive simply because the dollar price of gold sat at roughly $260 an ounce when he began his alleged tight money experiment, only for the dollar to plummet. Gold hitting a then all-time high of $875 an ounce in January of 1980. More than Fed critics and supporters would ever like to admit, and beyond the fact that the dollar's exchange value is not a Fed function. History is clear that currency devaluation, stability, or rising currency values are more than anything a political concept. Okay, John Tamny. First off, I guess it is like purchasing power in terms of other currencies. Yeah, it's right. It's the cleanest of the dirty laundry. You know, as David Stockman points out about the dollar. So you can say that the dollar is strong, but it's like, yeah, compared to what? You compare it to other currencies, okay, hey, look, they're devaluing their currency a lot more than we are. Oh, so the dollar, look at people rushing to the dollar, so it artificially strengthens our dollar. So yeah, you're to a certain extent, yeah, he's right. There is a lot of politics in it. But the Fed does indeed have effect on the exchange value of our currency. And it really does. It comes down to money supply. And this is why John Tamny is completely wrong in regards to his book. And it's this. Basically, John Tamny argues in his book that, well, the Federal Reserve is irrelevant, and so we don't need a Federal Reserve. That's his argument. And he points out that the money multiplier is a myth, that we actually never create new money. It doesn't happen. That's what he's saying. And that's why he always says in his book, credit is real resources. So that's what I just told you. That's basically where he's coming from. But this is where he's wrong. So when the Federal Reserve sets a target interest rate, you know, it's what, 0.75 to 1%, the federal funds rate. If they want to maintain that target, so when banks are lending and they need to borrow from another bank, or they need to borrow from the Fed to make up for the loan that this made out, for the Fed to basically lend to that bank at the federal funds rate, that money is created out of thin air. The Fed has to create new money to maintain their federal funds rate, to maintain that target. So that's why it doesn't make any sense what John Tamny's saying, that, look, we don't need a Fed, and he also argues for a 0% reserve requirement because he thinks real credit is real resources. I mean, I'm telling you, it doesn't make any sense at all. You need a central bank. If you want a fractional reserve banking system to work, you have to have a central bank. Our system today, you have to have a central bank based on the fractional reserve system. I'm sorry, this is really confusing, and it's kind of a minute point I'm making, but it's important to understand, and you really should read John Tamny's latest book. But he's completely wrong from my perspective. But I think he's a really great guy. I like him personally, but I think he's completely wrong, and it doesn't make any sense what he's saying. That yeah, we should do without a Fed. We should have a 0% reserve requirement, and that magically things are going to work out just fine. It's not going to happen. You need a central bank to maintain our system we have today, and to keep these target interest rates if you want. So, and just like what John Tamny says right here, this is examples he brings up in his book too. He says credit is never cheap. Booth fancies herself as in touch with reality, so the cheap money commentary signaled to this reviewer the excess influence of an editor eager to create an us versus them memoir. Again, in the real world, credit is always difficult to attain. In Hollywood, even the best movie producers have the request for credit to make films turned down 90% of the time. In Silicon Valley, credit is so expensive that startup visionaries must give up a big portion of their business to venture capitalists in order to attain credit, only for them to give up even more of the business in the form of stock options to lure quality employees. Okay, now, yeah, credit can be difficult to obtain. That's true, because there's competition for credit. That's why failure is so crucial in a free market, because people that have bad ideas, we want those bad ideas to end, to cease. And you want the good ideas to continue on. You want the good ideas to get financed, right? Well, that's why it is so great with all the private sector alternatives today for credit. But I don't know. Again, he's pointing out that credit is real resources and credit is difficult to achieve. And so he's basically arguing that the Fed can't cause the destruction that we Austrians think because credit is so hard to obtain. But the Fed distorts what is a good idea based on an artificially low interest rate. See, that's another thing that John Tamny and we don't see eye to eye. Like, he's missing that little point. So I don't know. I'm going to have to make this a part 2. That's all I'm going to get to on this piece here. And I hope what I said about all this stuff makes sense. It really is. I'm getting in the weeds. But this is important to understand this debate that is going on. How there are people like John Tamny, he's a libertarian. He doesn't like a monetarist. He certainly doesn't like the Keynesians. Actually, when John Tamny and I were debating on Facebook, he was calling me a Keynesian. So yeah, it was a great debate back and forth. I enjoyed it. Actually, I still have it all saved. So I will have to do a part 2 to this at some point. So I hope you guys got a lot out of this, because there is so many ways, there's so many nuances with arguments. There's one little thing you could miss, and you're like, okay, wait, that doesn't make sense. There's just so much going on. But here we are debating over something like this when there's so many people out there who don't get the large picture at all. They don't see the Federal Reserve as a problem. Like, what are you talking about? There's so many people that think government spending in general is a great thing. Yeah, we need more people on welfare. Yeah, we have people like Nancy Pelosi out there. Yes, welfare and food stamps help create jobs, help stimulate the economy. So there's so much to get to, and this was a little bit of an in the weeds episode, but I still think it was worth doing. And actually, did you guys listen to my episode last week? Man, I thought last week's episode is probably one of the top 5 episodes I've ever done. That is an episode you need to go share with your friends and family. Because I think what I did in that episode, I thought it came together very well. And it's a way of describing kind of where my perspective is on things and just the libertarian point of view in general, and using an example with space travel and NASA and how government pisses away resources compared to what the private sector can do. So you can say, oh yeah, we need the government to do that. But I always argue the private sector can do it better. And in that episode last week, I show how much better the private sector can do it. I think that episode was crucial. So please, go share last week's episode with your friends and family. Now, this week's episode, because it's so much in the weeds, just share it with your libertarian buddies, okay? So that is all I have for you guys today. So if you guys can just go to my website, go to justinmooreshow.com. Moore is spelled, of course, M-O-H-R. And you can click on the little Amazon widget there on the website. I get a small commission back on all your Amazon goods you purchase, so you can help support me, and it doesn't cost you anything extra. I mean, that is awesome. And also, join Tom Wood's Liberty Classroom. Learn the history you never learned in high school, that you never learned in college. Learn the economics you never learned in college. I learned from the Keynesian perspective in college. Everybody in general these days learns from the Keynesian perspective. Oh, this is the only perspective. They don't tell you about the other schools when you're in college. Nope, this is the way it is. So if you guys can do that for me, I will be back here next week, and I'm looking forward to it. This is Justin Moore, signing off.